Welcome to Torpedo Fish Radio, crossing the great divide between one mind and another. Today's show is about the civil rights movement, and in particular, an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. SNCC was made up of primarily black college students at segregated colleges and universities in the Deep South, who were doing incredibly dangerous work, encouraging and helping black residents of the southern states to register to vote. Some of the SNCC volunteers were white students from the North, and my guest today is one of those former volunteers by the name of Larry Rubin. Larry is a former city council member in the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland, and he is currently the communications director for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council of Carpenters, and he's also the treasurer for the SNCC Legacy Project. So let's listen to my interview with Larry Rubin.
I was an organizer and basically a foot soldier. I worked in Southwest Georgia and then in northern Mississippi between 1961 and 65. Our main job was to walk the red clay roads of the Deep South, talking to people, African Americans, encouraging them to go and register to vote. At that time, if you were an African American and you tried to register to vote in the Deep South, for sure you would lose your job, because chances are you work for a white person. Might lose your house, might have your house burned down, might get beaten up, or you might get shot, you might get killed. There was 30-some people between the 50s and 60s that got killed for voter registration, trying to register to vote. But what happened is, if you went down to try to register to vote, your name was put in the newspaper, and it was kept there for 2 weeks, your name and address. So it was very, very dangerous. And all that we could offer them was to say, well, if you get harassed, we will notify the Civil Rights Department of the federal government. It wasn't much protection. During the Kennedy administration, and later on during Johnson, nothing was done to protect people like me who were encouraging others to register to vote.
Can I just ask you, just for background, how old were you when you first got involved with SNCC?
I started out, I was 18 years old.
And were you a student at the time?
Yes. I was a student at Antioch College in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And the chair of SNCC at that time was named Chuck McDew. Later on, it became John Lewis. In 1960, across the South, African-American students at largely African-American schools began sitting in at lunch counters in the town where their school was. Lunch counters at Woolworths, at other what we used to call five and dime stores, sort of general stores, department stores on the downscale. Now, the students were allowed to spend their money buying little things, whatever they wanted, a shirt, but they were not allowed to sit down at lunch counters and order hamburgers or whatever it was. It was against the law. It was against the segregation laws that said that whites and blacks could not be eating in the same place. So black students across the South mounted these sit-ins. They were absolutely nonviolent. Students would sit there. They would be spat upon. They would be beaten. They would be arrested. And they engaged in non-resistance, just nonviolence.
So they would just, so if somebody would come up and spit on them or harass them, what would they do? Would they?
They would just sit there quietly and just engage in passive, what we call passive resistance, which was to be very passive. Exactly what it says. If they got beat up, there was ways that you could protect yourself by putting your hands around your head or something, but you certainly did not fight back.
And
these students would call the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC.
And could you say a little bit about what that was?
Well, that was Martin Luther King's organization.
Uh-huh.
And it was basically led by ministers, men, because it was mostly men, some women, of faith, who were trying to address issues of segregation and discrimination and inequality through nonviolent means. So students would call SCLC. We're going to have a sit-in certain place. Except 3 other schools would call SCLC and say, we're going to have a sit-in, happen to be the same day, but in a different state. So Martin Luther King's top assistant, a woman by the name of Ella Baker, who had a long history actually in the civil rights movement before this, suggested that they bring together students from across the South to discuss coordinating these sit-ins and also to discuss how SCLC could help and how they could help each other. So there was a conference held, I believe it was April 16th, 1960, in Raleigh, North Carolina, at Shaw University. And Ella Baker and others were there. There was a suggestion that the students become a student wing of SCLC. But to make a very long story short, they did not want to. It took a few other meetings, a few additional meetings, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded as a separate organization, and it was supposed to coordinate nonviolent activities across the South.
And were you at that meeting in
No, I was not at the first meeting. I was at some of the subsequent meetings.
Uh-huh.
There was a lot to work out, to found an organization. The first chair, by the way, was Marion Barry, who was to become mayor of Washington, D.C., and is now a council member from Ward 8 of Washington, D.C.
Right.
He wasn't chair very long, just about 6 months.
Uh-huh.
For a variety of reasons, it changed its focus away from demonstrations to voter registration work.
Uh-huh.
One of the reasons was they felt, I think correctly, that a fundamental issue was the lack of empowerment of African Americans in the South.
So I want to kind of give people a picture of what that was like. Like, did you go, when you went down south, did you get on a bus? Were you with other students? And when you arrived there, what did you actually do? Where did you stay?
Well, I met Chuck McDew actually in the cafeteria. He was visiting Antioch, not on any official capacity, but he was visiting his girlfriend, who was a student there. And we had lunch together. Next thing I know, I'm on a train, which gives you an idea of the time period, to Atlanta, where the offices of SNCC was. I show up, and there in the office was Julian Bond and Jim Foreman.
And they were?
Well, Julian Bond became rather well known, and he is well known today. He became chair of the NAACP. He was a state legislator in Atlanta, the first black state legislature in Georgia.
At the time, was he a student also? Or
Yes.
Uh-huh. So, and Jim Foreman was...
He was the executive director of SNCC.
Oh, okay.
He was really the boss, although we didn't use those terms because SNCC ran on the basis of what we call participatory democracy.
Oh, let's get back to that. Definitely want to talk about that. But so you arrived in Atlanta on the train, and there were these.
And I had my suitcases with me.
Uh-huh.
I go to the SNCC office, and Jim Foreman says, "Well, we want you to go down to Albany, Georgia. It's Albany, which was in Southwest Georgia." And you are to meet with Reverend Charles Sherrod, who was the head of the project there. And actually, I flew from Atlanta to Albany.
And when you, where did you, did they put you up, or did you stay with people in the community? Or?
Well, the short answer is, for the vast majority of time that I was in the South, I stayed with people in the community, which was very dangerous for these people, especially to house a white person. An African American having a white person stay overnight, this is very dangerous, especially a movement person. And in Southwest Georgia, I stayed with a woman named Dolly Raines. Everybody called her Mama Dolly. She was a woman. She seemed old to me. For all I know, I'm older than she is now. But she had a little farm in the countryside, and she put several of us up. My first assignment, interestingly enough, was to drive around with Pete Seeger.
Oh, wow.
He had come down to Southwest Georgia, first of all, to learn about the movement, but also to sing songs and to try to encourage people and build courage in people and build empowerment through song. And so we traveled around several communities in Southwest Georgia with him. But the real job, as I said, was to walk these very bleak country roads, just talking to people. We've always said that what we were doing was not at all revolutionary, walking and talking to people. Who we were doing it with, that was revolutionary. We were doing it with sharecroppers, with people who were extremely poor, who had never been politically empowered in their lives, and whose organization in the communities was basically the churches. They did get a certain sense of empowerment from the churches. But to show you how it was, early on, I was walking one of these roads. Actually, there was two white guys, me and Jack Chatfield, his name was, and a guy named John O'Neill, who in later years became an actor and started the Southern Free Theater. He's still in the South. He's still in New Orleans. Anyway, we were walking along. We were driving along, not walking. And we pulled our car into a general store that we thought was owned by a black guy. We went in and started to talk to some of the customers there. And the guy who we thought owned it asked us to leave because he was afraid. He said he was afraid that his store would get burned down. So we did. We left our car parked partially in his parking lot, and we started to walk. After talking to a few people, walking, I'll say about a mile and a half, Deputy Sheriff drives up to us, and he arrests us for trespassing because we left our car partially parked in the parking lot. Turned out that the sheriff of the county owned this general store, and this was his parking lot. So we were arrested for trespassing.
Oh, wow.
They never arrested you for voter registration or for helping people to get their civil rights. They arrested you for things like, hey, that shirt looks like something that was stolen from the department store last week. Show me the sales slip from that shirt. Well, nobody carries a sales slip for a shirt. Okay, you're arrested on suspicion of stealing that shirt. Once I was arrested for having a bad headlight. Except it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you don't need a headlight at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Before you got to Albany, did you have an idea of what it was going to be like, and how did the reality correspond to what you thought it would be like? I
went down motivated by the same thing that motivated a lot of whites at the time. We didn't go down with the idea of we're going to help black people get the right to vote. We weren't that arrogant. What we did feel was that because Southern senators and representatives were at that time running the country because of the seniority system, the longer you were in Congress, automatically the higher you rose up, and most of the chairs of the House and Senate committees were Southerners.
And this is what year? This is 1960?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And they were dismantling the New Deal. They were dismantling a lot of programs that we were benefiting from, student loans, the right to join unions, and so forth. So we felt that the reason they were allowed to run the country was because their own constituents were not allowed to vote in elections.
Uh-huh.
And if we helped people get the right to vote, they would vote out these people. And in fact, that's what happened. One of the first things that I learned was it was all well and good to be motivated by general principles. In my case, it was political. In other people's cases, it was faith-based. Mm-hmm. We are here because people are equal by the fact that they're all God's children. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to come down with that kind of motivation. It's another to understand that the job, the day-to-day job, was to do things like helping Mrs. Jones get a car so that she could go down to register to vote, or helping people go to what we called mass meetings, or, as I said, walking and just talking to people. The actual work was rather tedious. It was like they say in the Army. It was many days of tedium broken up by hours of sheer terror. Getting adjusted to that was quite an adjustment, especially not being familiar with Southern culture. For one thing, it was hard to understand what anybody was saying, white or black. For a while there, every white person you meet they say, "What the fuck you doing here, boy?"
Really?
Yeah, what the fuck you doing? I thought that's the way Southerners said hello. I didn't know.
How would you respond when somebody said that?
Well, it depends who they are. If they're the sheriff or somebody with a billy club, I took to saying yassa. Didn't help. They would arrest me or beat me up anyway. But towards the end, I was in the South for on and off for about 5 years. Towards the end, I became pretty mouthy. And somebody attacked me, I would say things like, you hit me, I'm going to sue you, or, you see this watch, or actually, I'll give a real example. You see this radio in this car? Well, this is connected directly to the Justice Department in Washington, and they're hearing everything you're saying. Now, that was believable at the time because CB's, radios were first coming in, and people didn't really understand what they were doing. And they believed if you said new technology, can do this.
Did you just think that up, or was this like a...
It was a common thing that a lot of us thought up.
Wow. And you actually got physically beaten?
Yeah, quite a few times. But you ask about adjusting to it and how did we react. What I'm trying to say is we knew intellectually what the movement was about. We learned the reality of what the movement did, which was, as I say, get a car for somebody, talk with people, organize groups, get them to meetings, the purpose of which was to help empower them to register to vote. That was what the movement did day to day. Those were the actions. The goals were, of course, equality, was to end segregation. And even though our stress was on voter registration, we did also have demonstrations and segregated facilities, public schools, everything. What mostly was tough adjusting to was fear. I spent 5 years on and off afraid. It was like a tight knot in your stomach. This is what fear felt like. And getting adjusted to operating with fear, that was the challenge. The fear would not go away. And everybody felt the same. People who did very heroic acts, the reason they were heroes was they did them despite the fear. Martin Luther King, and he would be the first person to tell you this because I knew him and I worked with him, what he did, his job was to make speeches. His job was to be the face of the movement. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, he didn't have time really to do much organizing or to be in the trenches because he was the face of the movement. The movement itself were thousands, hundreds of thousands maybe, of people throughout the South who were, as I said earlier, were risking their homes, their lives, their livelihoods to try to register to vote. Same thing can be said for people who were risking everything to sit in at a lunch counter. They were risking these things. They did not want to sacrifice. They were people just like you and me.
So we're about the voting, especially the voting rights being abridged. Had any of these people that you met along the way ever not had trouble registering to vote? Was it something that became more exacerbated with time? Was there ever a time that they, that was not as bad as it was when you got there?
Yes. In the 1870s, during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, which the federal government put into place, where Northern troops were still in the South, African Americans, freed slaves, had the absolute right to vote. They could run for office. I met many people who said their grandfather or their great-grandfather were sheriffs, congressmen, senators, African Americans, or policemen. These were rights that were taken away after Reconstruction by what they called Jim Crow laws. First, African Americans were freed from slavery. It was a short period where they were, in fact, treated as equal under the law. Then new laws were passed, Jim Crow laws, that created the concept of separate but equal schools, that created the concept of segregation as a legal thing.
And was that in the 20th century, or when were most of these laws passed?
Well, it started in the late 19th, went up actually to the 20s, the 1920s, throughout the South.
When people tried to vote, were they cited, this is, code X, Y, and Z says you can't, or was it more subtle? I mean, how did that transpire?
First, what they had throughout the South was what they called poll taxes.
Uh-huh.
You had to pay a rather large sum of money, especially if you were a tenant farmer, in order to vote. There was a big movement against that.
And was that something that was applied across the board?
It was state by state.
But I mean, would white farmers have to pay it also, and they just figured that, if you were black, you couldn't afford it, or?
Well, there was ways of getting around it for whites.
Uh-huh.
But there was poll taxes and there was lynchings to discourage people from voting and from exercising their legal rights. gradually there were federal laws passed against poll tax, and then federal laws passed against lynching. But these were major fights that took decades. By the time of the 50s and 60s, and understand, up until the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and then the Civil Rights Act, states had the power to regulate voting. So by the time the 50s and 60s rolled around, what most southern states had instituted were literacy tests.
Oh.
And the way it would work is this. There would be a piece of paper you were given when you tried to register to vote. The key questions would be copy down XYZ section, and that was, what section it was would be up to the registrar of the state of Mississippi, the state of Louisiana, the state of Georgia, whatever Constitution. Copy down this passage of the Mississippi Constitution. Then interpret it to the satisfaction of the registrar. Now, some of these registrars themselves were illiterate.
Right.
But the way it would work is if a white came in, the registrar would say, okay, copy this down. It would be, let's say, the title, Mississippi State Constitution. You copy that down. What does that mean? That's the title. Oh, you pass. Black came in, copy this down. It would be, on the fourth Wednesday of every Friday, if it rains in the state of Mississippi, the right to bear arms would be abridged. I read this Constitution of the state of Mississippi, and it doesn't mean much.
Was this actually going on when you were there? Were they?
Yes.
And so...
and we would, part of what we did was we tried to teach people how to pass these tests. We had classes in these tests. It didn't work very well because no matter how much, the famous question that blacks would be asked is how many bubbles in a bar of soap.
Really? No, I've never heard that.
That happened several times. In fact, there's a famous case. It was in a movie called Freedom Song, Hollywoodized a bit, where an elderly gentleman would go in, the registrar would ask how many bubbles in a bar of soap, and the gentleman would say, well, I really don't know. Well, you fail. Well, I wonder, just from my own knowledge, my own education, would you tell me how many bubbles are in a bar of soap so I'll know? Of course, he was arrested.
For asking that question?
For asking a question. Well, it wasn't. Wow. You're not arrested for asking a question. You're arrested for disturbing the peace.
Oh, wow.
At that time, it was across the country. This was before the Miranda law, which gave you certain rights, when you were arrested. It was before other kind of laws that gave you rights too. Most police agencies, I believe this is around the country, were able to arrest you and keep you in jail for 72 hours on suspicion, just suspicion of something. So they never really had to book you. I was arrested on suspicion of carrying literature threatening to overthrow the state of Mississippi.
And what was the literature? Was it the New York Times?
No, actually, what it was, I was hauling books. I'm jumping ahead now to 1964. I was hauling books from the North for libraries at freedom schools.
And say what the freedom schools were.
Well, these were schools that we set up mostly during the summer of '64. Some of them lasted longer. And it was because public schools are being closed rather than integrate. So we set up our own schools, freedom schools. So these are freedom school library books. And there were things like the Bobbsey twins, the Nancy Drew mysteries, These were books rejected by well-meaning people in the North. And so, literature threatening to overthrow the state of Mississippi. By that time, I had been in the South for quite a while.
Uh-huh.
And what they said was the literature was not what I was carrying, but were personal letters that I had in my briefcase. They stopped us in Oxford, Mississippi,
Ew.
which is the home of Ole Miss. And his sheriff stood about 3 foot nothing. I forget his name. Sheriff Baxter. It began with a B. Anyway, he hauled us all out of the truck. He called in the local paper, and he had our picture taken with him as if we were deer, that he had shot, or a big fish that he was holding up. And then he arrested us on suspicion of carrying literature, threatening to overthrow the state of Mississippi, because he found letters, personal letters that I had written or was about to mail, and some that I had received, talking about conditions in Mississippi. I explained to the sheriff at the time that I said, the law, and by the way, this was before Freedom Summer, and Mississippi passed a whole bunch of laws to try to prevent Freedom Summer from happening. Freedom Summer was when about 1,000 volunteers came down to do voter registration work, freedom school work, other anti-segregation work. They passed what they call anti-invader laws because they were expecting this invasion from the North. And one of them outlawed carrying literature threatening to overthrow the state of Mississippi. As far as I know, I was the only one ever arrested on that. But I wasn't arrested on the laws. I was arrested on suspicion of violating the law.
Right.
I explained to him, I said, Sheriff, I'm a law student. I lied. I said, you need to have more than one copy of something for it to be considered literature. And he said, And then he said some things which I really don't want to repeat, because they were pretty vicious. And he arrested us. He kept us in Oxford for 3 days.
And were you afraid for your life?
I had been afraid for my life for 5 years.
So it wasn't any different, or was this?
Not particularly, no.
Wow. So like every single day could be the day?
Yes.
Wow.
Especially around this time, this was about the same time as the 3 civil rights workers had disappeared. Actually, they had left a training program for the Freedom Summer, which was taking place in Oxford, Ohio, just by coincidence, same name. And that's where I picked up the books from. I came down about a day before they did from Oxford. I had been there. So had Mickey Schwerner. I had been in the South for many years, so had he. We went up to Oxford to take part in the training, to help train others. But we didn't stay because we had these other assignments. In any case, we were arrested for about 3 days. Then we were let loose. And then we drove north a little bit and arrived in Holly Springs. Holly Springs was where I was stationed. I had been stationed for a number of years. And we were then arrested again. At that time, I told the sheriff, I said, this is getting old. Either keep us in jail, or let us go. But this arresting in and out, 3 days here, 3 days there, was getting rough. So I was arrested in Oxford, went to Holly Springs, was arrested again for suspicion of something or another. They kept us in jail for several days and then let us go. A few days later, about a week later, in the papers was a headline, Senator Eastland has made a speech in the Congressional Record about how the communists were running the civil rights movement. And his evidence was Rubin's little black book. It was an address book that I was very foolishly carrying and was stolen from me. I noticed it was missing from my briefcase. it was either stolen in Oxford or Holly Springs. I'll never know. And he read addresses from this book, and some that were not in the book, into the congressional record.
Wow.
And some of them were rather progressive people, and this was evidence that I was in touch with the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. They had lied. It was not a little black book. It was a little reddish-brown book. But still, black book, I guess, sound better.
Black,
Yeah. Now, the context of it was Eastland was trying to prove that the disappearance of the 3 civil rights workers was a hoax. Oh. He kept saying that they were voluntarily disappeared. He said they were laughing it up on Moscow gold in a New York hotel room.
What? What does that even mean, Moscow gold?
Well, he was striking the anti-communist chord.
Oh, like they were shipped off to New York by the international...
Yeah, they had money from Moscow.
Uh-huh.
And he was hitting the anti-Semitic chord because New York in Mississippi meant Jews.
Right.
And, of course, 2 of them were Jewish.
Did this get any traction in Congress? I mean...
Well, I don't think so. It did in the South. His speech was rewritten, was reproduced. Uh-huh. I was never so scared in my life because they printed my picture in newspapers throughout the South. At least before, I could move around from town to town, and people didn't know my face. Now they did.
And did you feel, did people actually recognize you? Did you...
Well, actually, that fear was never realized. Mm-hmm. What I was mostly worried about and afraid of, but in a different sense, when I used the word fear at first, I was talking about that knot in my belly. Mm-hmm. When I'm using the word afraid now, I mean concerned about. I was concerned that the black community, who I've been working with for several years, would become afraid of me, mm-hmm. and I would be marginalized from the people that we were trying to work with, that we were organizing. It turned out that fear was totally unfounded. It turned out that the black community as a whole never believed anything these white politicians said in the first place. Uh-huh. So they certainly didn't believe this either. Number 2, a lot of people came up to me and said, I don't care if you're a communist or not, you've put your life on the line with us.
Wow.
And that's all we care about.
Because, I was going to ask you about this. There's, I've read in different places that the role of the white volunteers from the North, not everyone welcomed that, or there might have been some tensions. Like if a white person gets killed, makes it into the papers, but all these black people had been killed and nobody cared in the rest of the country. Or
Well, that's just touching the tip of the iceberg of that question. When I went to work in Southwest Georgia in late 60, early 61, that was the only SNCC project in the South where whites were allowed to work. And the reason was that Reverend Charles Sherrod, who, by the way, is still there, and there is still the Southwest Georgia project going. In a way, it's the only SNCC project still in existence. His faith in the beloved community, which meant black and whites working together, was so deep that he felt it was a very important part of the movement to illustrate to the white community and to the black community that blacks and whites could work together and the whites didn't have to be the boss. Mm-hmm. My fundamental job, actually later on in Mississippi too, was basically to illustrate that whites didn't have to be the boss.
What do you mean by that, your fundamental job? Was that...
Well, for example, when we were talking with people in these shacks trying to encourage them to vote, register to vote, my main job was just to stand there, and let the African-American guy with me do most of the talking. That changed a little bit once people got used to me. I did go out by myself, but it took a long time. But it was true that SNCC felt a lot of people had been killed. Reverend Lee in Mississippi, several others, for registering to vote, for attempting to register to vote. Charles Sherrod's father-in-law had been killed. And it made no impression. SNCC felt, as a matter of strategy, that if they brought whites in, there's a book that was put out several years ago called If White Kids Die. They felt that having whites there would be protection against blacks being hurt or killed, because if whites were there and they got killed, everybody knew that the whole nation would know about it. To that extent, what I just said, it didn't work, because 2 whites were killed. The nation did learn about it, but it didn't protect blacks, unfortunately, during Freedom Summer. And understand, when those 3 civil rights workers disappeared and when Eastland was saying that it was a hoax, we knew exactly what happened. We knew they were killed, because the people that killed them wanted us to know. This was a public lynching. They wanted to frighten people away from coming down for Freedom Summer. That didn't work either. The 1,000 people who were in Oxford, Ohio, when they heard about the 3 civil rights workers being killed, didn't stop them. They came to Mississippi anyway. But it also didn't protect blacks from being beaten up and harassed. But that was the feeling, and it worked in the sense that it became a very well-known case that these people were killed, and it was one of the impetuses for passing the Civil Rights Bill, and it was one of the impetuses for the federal government sending protection in the South. Earlier, I said they never sent protection for people trying to get other people to register to vote, but they did send protection after a while.
Like National Guard or FBI?
Well, no, the National Guard or soldiers.
I mean, like where would people go to register to vote? Like at the courthouse or something where they stand there?
But they never did. My point is they never did send protection for that.
Oh, okay.
They did send protection for people who were demonstrating.
Oh, okay.
For marches. So to that extent, it helped. But the larger question was this: could whites effectively organize blacks? And it was a very, very emotional and very difficult question. At the time, in the Deep South, most African Americans were victims of segregation, and they were brought up to both be afraid of whites and to yield to doing whatever a white person said. Now, when I say that, this was in front of white people. There was always 2 cultures. There was what we would call the shuck and jive culture, that blacks would use towards whites. And then there was the real black culture, where, they organized themselves, as I said, through churches, and developed a culture that was powerful enough and brave enough to take the risks that I was earlier talking about, trying to register to vote. The real heroes of the civil rights movement were what we call the local people, not us. We could always leave. It was the local people that were the heroes. But the question was, were the presence of white organizers a complicating factor? I had a lot of people who I would talk to register to vote, and they would say, "Yassa, Larry," or "Yassa, boy." And maybe they actually would go to register to vote, but because a white person told them to, which was not the point at all. The point was for them to gain a sense of empowerment. Was it possible for whites to be in that role? Well, in the end, the answer was no. And SNCC developed the philosophy of that the real role of whites was to fight racism in the white community. That the real problem was in the white community, not the black community. The real issue was the black community being victims of a racist society imposed on them by whites. So the idea was whites should organize whites and blacks should organize blacks.
And did you end up doing it?
Actually, I did.
In the South?
Yes. I went to work in Kentucky for another organization called the Southern Conference Educational Fund. That's another story, organizing whites. But what I'm describing was a very hard emotionally for a lot of people, a lot of white people, who felt they were being kicked out of SNCC and kicked out of the civil rights movement. And that feeling had a lot of reverberations for many, many years.
Did you feel that way?
Well, I did not. In part because I came down with this rather intellectual approach, this political approach.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you mean the sort of the thing that you said at the beginning about the seniority in Congress? And,
yes. And so, in a way, I didn't take it personally. And I always had the notion that the essence of organizing was to start where the people were at. That's a phrase we always use, start where the people are at. Ella Baker used to say that in SNCC. Do what the people say do. And so my attitude was that if I was a complicating factor, I accepted that. And I saw the black community was doing a hell of a good job on its own. You know, they didn't need me.
So is it like whatever works? Just
well, in a way, whatever works, yes.
Did you
do what the people say do? And I did.
So one thing that I'm curious about is whether maybe working with the white community or just during any time that you were there, were you ever able to in any way understand what motivated white Southerners to resist black empowerment or integration? I mean, could you ever like get your head in that place where you could kind of, I don't know, grasp what the problem was?
Well, I can repeat what was said. Now, what was said by whites, especially when they went to beat us up, was, well, in my case, you know, I'm a traitor to my race. I'm not going to use the terms they used. In fact, when I got thrown in jail, they would ask me, was I white or black? They didn't use the term black. I'd always say black because I didn't want to get thrown in with the whites.
What do you mean they ask you if you're white? What does that?
Well, they're trying to insult me. You know, and I wouldn't be insulted. I would say I was black because jails are segregated too. And I would much rather be in the black section than in the white. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But what the whites said was what we were about. First of all, they used sexual terms. You know, all we wanted to do was have race mixing, and they meant sexually. And this was the first thing on their mind. This is what they stated. You know, you just want to fuck black people, or, you know, black guys just want to screw with white women. This said a lot. This was the first thing that was said on the ground. Then they would call us communists. You know, you're just here to destroy our society, destroy our way of life. You don't really care about anybody. And they would say, you know, we have excellent race relations here in the South. our people are happy. We have worked out a way of living together. And they would sometimes point to their maid. Hey, Mary, tell them, have I ever beaten you? What do you think? And Mary would say, no, I like it here. Then later on, chances are Mary would get a hold of me and say, I didn't mean that, but that's my job. I had to say it.
Right.
But did whites actually believe all this? That they had a good race relations? And they would always say, there's no crime down here. And, up north, you have X number of murders a year. Down here, we don't. Well, they were right in a sense, except the murders that were down there were done by the state, were done by the police. You're asking, where did hatred come from? And I actually have two answers to that. A lot of whites, I have three answers to that. A lot of whites were, in fact, inculcated from birth to truly believe that they were superior to blacks, that their job was to be, to patronize blacks, to take care of them, but in return, blacks had to do all the work. That's one thing. Another version was to hate blacks, to be afraid of blacks. And a lot of people said, if blacks had got the majority, blacks in this county the majority, if they ever got the right to vote, they would treat us like we're treating them.
So they would actually come out and say that.
I've heard whites say that directly, yes.
At least that's honest.
But, and we hate them because they're out to get us. Because we know we're out to get them.
Oh.
And then
you think they felt guilty?
Well,
or
I don't know. And then this sexual thing, that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another answer to your question, too. And I've learned this in recent years because I've gone south quite a few times and spoken to a lot of whites recently, in recent years, past 10 years. And they would tell me that they were just as afraid of the Klan as black people were. That if they were caught talking in an equal manner to black people, the Klan would knock on their door and say, we know you're doing this and you got to cut it out. Whites were under the system of fear as well. And the evidence that I have, and I don't know percentages, I'm not going to say most or many, I don't know. But a lot of whites really knew that the whole segregation system and whites being superior to blacks was, pardon the expression, bullshit. And the evidence is, now in the South, there's a higher percentage of mixed marriages than anywhere else. In Mississippi has the highest number, not just percentage, but number of black elected officials of any other state. It's a very conservative state socially in many ways. Homophobia is rampant among blacks and whites. But on this issue, many whites felt then, during segregation, this was bullshit. And when the laws changed, when they were free of these laws, they acted like people do. As I said, in the South, especially in rural areas, blacks and whites live side by side. You did away with the laws. They did what more normal people do. They acted like friends. They got together. This is what people do.
Wow.
The purpose of segregation, as I said earlier, was to keep blacks oppressed. But if you think about it, why did they have to pass laws aimed at keeping races separate? If like they said in the South, it's natural for races to live apart, then why do you need laws? You don't need a law against people flapping their arms and flying,
Right.
because it doesn't happen. You don't need laws when something is natural.
Mm-hmm.
You need laws to prevent things that are natural. So these laws were put into effect to the extent that they were put into effect to keep races separate, because you needed laws to keep races separate. Otherwise, folks would normally get together with other folks. I have a story to tell that gives, I think, evidence for what I'm just saying. During the same period of time when actually it was a little bit later, when it was discovered that the 3 civil rights workers had been killed. Back there in Holly Springs, Mississippi, we were helping to organize a brick-making factory. And this is early '65. SNCC and other organizations were beginning to address economic issues.
Mm-hmm.
Not the right to vote, not integration, but economic inequality. So what we were doing was helping to organize a brick-making factory. That's the background of the story. This was, at the time, as I said, the 3 civil rights workers. It was just discovered that they had been murdered. And actually a 4th person had been murdered too, named Wayne Yancey, who was a volunteer from the North, from Chicago, African-American guy. Didn't get too much publicity.
No, I've never heard of it.
But he was killed in Holly Springs, where we were. And one night, in the middle of the night, there was a knock on the door of Freedom House. Freedom House was where we were living. I said earlier that mostly we lived with local people, but not always. In some cases, we lived together in what we called freedom houses, blacks and whites living together, to demonstrate to the community it could be done, and also so as not to put local people at risk. And also it was our offices. Freedom houses were our offices, where we did our work from. People would come to ask for help. Middle of the night, knock at the door. Rubin, get out here. And it was a deputy sheriff, a guy who had arrested me, had beaten me up earlier. And I went out. The reason I did, it's strange to tell, but people had gotten killed, and all of us had this idea that, well, our time has come. We're going to get killed. It's like I said earlier, we didn't want to sacrifice our lives. We didn't want to get killed. We just thought there's no way out, kind of. It's a hard... I've heard soldiers describe this kind of feeling in the middle of battle. They're just sure they were next to be killed. So I was sure that I was going to die. Might as well be now, as later. And also, we didn't want the neighborhood, which was black, to think that we were afraid of the police. So I went out. I got in this deputy sheriff's car, and he drove me into the piney woods. Now, what was on my mind was this was similar to what had happened to the 3 civil rights workers that were killed. They had been arrested, they were let out of jail, and they were sort of herded in their car into Piney Woods by Sheriff Rainey. So I had this in my mind. It wasn't exactly the same circumstance, but it was similar. I didn't say anything. The deputy sheriff didn't say anything. He drives off into a little clearing in the woods. And he says, Rubin, he says, are you have something to do with organizing that brick-making factory? Now, as I indicated earlier, I felt under no compunction to tell the truth to these people. These were people who were out to kill me. But I thought I was going to die anyway, so I said, yes, I am. And he said, you stick to that. He said, my brother works there. And no whites had signed cards. The way you organize people in a factory that want to have a union vote have to sign a certain card. All the blacks in this factory had signed. They'd also gotten their church burnt down because they had a union meeting in it. But no whites had signed these cards. This deputy sheriff said, my brother works there. And all the whites are going to vote for the union, but they're not going to sign the cards to have the vote in the first place. So you stick with that. I turned to him, I said, what? What? I said, you stupid son of a bitch. I did say that. I said, I could have had a heart attack coming out. You could have killed me just through fear. I could have keeled over. Why did you do this way? And he said, because the sheriff knows everything. He knows everything that's going on. And I wanted to make it seem like I was harassing you. So I could tell the sheriff I did all this. Now the community will tell him, yeah, he pulled Rubin out there and he had Rubin scared, shit. For all I know, his brother was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Huh. But they knew that in order to get higher wages, they needed a union. And they knew in order to get a union, they had to work black and white together. And they did.
Wow.
And my point is, this goes back to your question about did I ever understand, the mentality of white Southerners. And I'm saying part of the answer was they were victims of the system. Mm-hmm. Poor whites, working people whites. I'm not talking about the plantation owners who set white against black, who had these laws passed in the first place in order to keep blacks down, in order to keep white working people down too. Mm-hmm. I've seen the case, and there was a case in this brick-making factory where the boss would tell the blacks, you're lucky to have a job. I could fire you and hire white people. Tell the whites, I'm paying you $0.25 an hour more than I'm paying the blacks because you're white. So keep your mouth shut.
It's kind of like Rwanda, where the Belgians just told these two different people, we're going to...
The Tutsis and the...
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And that's exactly what had been going on in the South ever since Reconstruction. So I think part of the answer was a lot of whites knew it was bullshit, but were victims themselves, had to do it, but given the opportunity, like organizing this brick-making factory, or later on when the laws were lifted, they worked with blacks because they knew that they were in the same boat together.
So earlier you said that, white volunteers, people from the North, could leave at any time. Why didn't you leave?
Well, I left twice. Once from Georgia because my lung collapsed.
Was it from a beating?
I don't actually know. It didn't collapse after a beating. It was called a spontaneous pneumothorax. And it was some nervousness. It took me a while to realize that my lung had collapsed. I was had shortness of breath. I had pain in one side. It wasn't directly connected to any incident. But I did leave. And it took 3 months to heal. I went back to Antioch, and I stayed in the infirmary for 3 months. Then actually after that, I came to Washington, D.C. here, and I was a community organizer in Anacostia at the Barry Farms housing project. Then after that, I went to Mississippi. At the time, SNCC had certain projects in the North, like at Barry Farms. Although officially it was not a SNCC project. It was a Southeast Neighborhood House project, but a lot of SNCC people on it. Then I went to Mississippi. I left when, after Eastland made the speech about me, and I think I mentioned that I lost my, or maybe I didn't. Aside from getting my name in the paper, Eastland arranged for me to be drafted, and I was. And I know Eastland did it because
was this common? I've never heard of that before.
Well, common, I don't know. I do know it was true in my case through papers that through FOIA, the Federal Freedom of Information Act.
Wow.
I got certain papers, and this has been written up in different books. Eastland did this. He called his buddy, and somewhere or another, who either directly or indirectly called their buddy in the draft board in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I was drafted. I never did go into the Army. That's a different story. But that took me a couple of months. So I left Mississippi for that purpose, and then I came back. Question is, why didn't I leave altogether?
Or I guess...
that's a good question.
Well, one thing that I was thinking is more like, what sustained you? Were there, talked about the fear and all these bad experiences. Did you have good experiences?
Well, I had the best experiences of my life. I mean, imagine the satisfaction of being part of this, of seeing people that were tenant farmers who all their lives had no say in anything that affected them. And you were part of something, even though in my case it was a small part, that helped them gain the empowerment to register to vote, to have a say in what was going on. That's tremendous satisfaction. You grow to love the people that you're working with. It's like in the Army. Mm-hmm. People will talk about their best experiences being with the people with whom they fought. Mm-hmm. Today, I am the treasurer of the SNCC Legacy Project. These are all people that worked in the South. We all worked in the South together. Julian Bond, Marion Barry is in this. Lawrence Giat, who just died last week, was in this. And we are now trying to pass the torch to people who will be around when we're gone. And some of us have left, like Larry Giat. We think that there are lessons to be learned from what we did. You mentioned earlier that you wanted me to talk about participatory democracy. Mm-hmm. This really was the model of decision-making that was picked up by most of the student movement in the 60s. And the idea was that you wouldn't have people, quote, being in charge. You would make decisions collectively. Participatory democracy, direct democracy. Did it work? Well, matter of fact, what happened mostly was we had meetings last 2-3 days to make a decision. And the people left awake after all this. Last people, I can't say standing, the last people sitting would make the decision.
Were you trying to reach consensus?
It was even more than consensus. It was unanimity.
Oh.
But it was, yes, consensus in the sense that we didn't need necessarily unanimity over any given subject in the sense that we all said the exact same thing. But yes, consensus in that we would all feel comfortable with going ahead with whatever decision was made. And that process, too, taught me a lot. You might say, I've never left this kind of work. After the South, I went into union organizing. After I left SCEF, this Southern Conference Educational Fund. And I've been an organizer in one way or another ever since.
So, this past fall with the election, there was a lot of publicity about things like decreasing the hours for early voting in states where, in previous years there have been an overflow of voting. And
having to show identity papers, but it's only a certain kind of identity papers.
Yeah.
This is the literacy test all over again. And they operate the same way as a literacy test. White person comes in with an out-of-date driver's license. Yeah, Joe, I know you anyway. Mm-hmm. African-American person comes in, registrar, not the registrar, but the person at the voting booth might have known this person all their lives. Sam, your driver's license is out of date. You cannot vote. It's literacy tests all over again.
Did you feel disheartened by this at all, or were you?
Well, I must say, going into the election, I felt anger. Mm-hmm. I recognized what was going on. Coming out of the election, I could not have been more thrilled because the places where the Tea Party and the Republicans tried these voter suppression gimmicks the hardest, Florida and Ohio, those were the two main states, but there were other states as well, Wisconsin, Illinois too. Those were the very places where people waited in line sometimes over 8 hours. Those were the very places that had the highest voter turnout. I could not have been more heartened by the reaction of the American people to this kind of bullshit. I was more heartened by this than anything else in many, many years.
Wow.
Will it continue? I think yes. And I think we must be very vigilant about it. Because people are not going to stay in line 8 hours every single time.
Yeah.
And in fact, recently, I believe it was the governor of Florida, Scott Brown, is that his name?
I think so. I'm not sure.
But it was the governor of Florida. Yeah. I saw him on TV.
The bald guy.
The bald guy, giving this talk about, how we got to tighten what he called voter accountability.
You mean even after the election?
Yes, this was a couple of weeks ago. And he said he's sorry that more voter accountability wasn't in place before the election.
Oh.
So this is still a very live issue. And in fact, it's an issue that those of us who did voter registration work around the country are getting pretty active in.
Oh, really? Again, wow.
Again, yes. I don't exactly have the opportunity to in Maryland and in the district. These are not places where there's going to be tight races. But in Virginia, there's a big challenge, and people are going into Virginia to address the issue there.
Were people? I know that there was efforts to get the laws overturned, but to your knowledge, were people doing things like going to Virginia or Pennsylvania and driving people to get their voter IDs, paying for it when there was a big? Do you know of any activities like that? Because I was thinking, why aren't I hearing about stuff like that?
Well, the problem is that most of these requirements are so onerous that isn't a question if you had somebody to help you do it, you could pass. But people were going into these states to help people physically get to vote. Were carrying them down in cars, organizing carpools and things like that. And there were lots of legal challenges to these horrendous voter suppression efforts. I don't know the percentages, but many challenges succeeded. And many of the efforts
That's true.
failed in court.
Yeah, that's a good victory also.
And that shows that the country's changed, too.
Yeah, it's true. It just seemed like there's something changing, but at the same time, there's forces like you were mentioning, the governor who's still trying to undo or to perpetuate the violations that were going on.
And in fact, I'll add something else. The truth is that a lot of members of the Tea Party, there's no such thing as the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. These are just sort of ad hoc groups here and there. I don't even know if there's such a thing as a Tea Party card, but those who would self-identify themselves as Tea Party activists or whatever, a lot of them are, in fact, acting against their own interests.
Yeah.
These are not rich people. Rich people are financing the Tea Party and are lying to the people that are in it and are fooling them. I mean, the Koch brothers and all of this, they're behind the Tea Party. But I recognize the same kind of dynamics today within the Tea Party that I recognized in the South in things like the Ku Klux Klan and in people like this sheriff and his brother. Mm-hmm. They were just fooled. Mm-hmm. Today, they don't have what you might call the excuse of being afraid of laws or afraid that the Klan is going to knock on their door. But like a lot of working class white people in the South then, and a lot of working class white people now in the Tea Party, they're simply fooled. They're lied to, and for a variety of reasons, they're believing it.
Yeah.
And this goes back to something that I said before. You got to start where the people are at. Do what the people say do. In my opinion, what needs to be done, the real job that needs to be done today that would be an answer to movements for voter suppression, to movements against having people immigrate to this country, is to explain, to organize folks that would be inclined to be in the Tea Party how they are in fact being fooled. This is not only the job that needs to be done today, it is also one of the hardest jobs in the world. I think, and it was, by the way, one of the hardest jobs in the world in the 60s as well, to organize blacks and whites. I should say to organize whites and blacks. It seemed like the hardest job in the world then.
Well, one reason why I wanted to talk to you now is because I think that whether it's by design or just by neglect, I think that the kinds of stories that you're talking about today are being forgotten. And I think that if more people knew the background and the way that the current leaders are trying to put down people's franchise, I don't know, I just think that educating people more about the history could help bring some people to the light, so to speak.
Well, Lisa, I'll tell you, my opinion is, the stories that I've told, I mean, they did happen. They're interesting to me because they happened to me. But you don't necessarily learn from the stories themselves. I think what needs to be stressed is, number one, what we did was organize. We got people together, working together. That's why legal segregation was ended. And all the civil rights movement did was end legal segregation. But it wasn't guys like me, getting arrested and arguing about, am I going to give the county of Holly Springs more money? That's really not what the movement was about. The movement was about people getting together. I think there are several things that mitigate against that today. Number one, when I was coming up, the idea of collective action, of doing things with other people, was in the air, was simply assumed. The major experience that our parents had was World War II. And that was definitely a collective action. And Americans were taught, we're working together to fight Hitler. Nobody said, hey, we got this one guy who's going to go over there and kill Hitler. It wasn't that. It was collective action. And unions, the idea of people getting together in unions.
So you think this sort of fetishization of the individual pulling himself by the bootstraps is part of that?
Well, yes, I do. But it's even more subtle than that. When I was coming up, what was in the air was, hey, let's get together and change things. Everybody would say that. On the left and the right, everybody.
Right.
Today, what's said at best is one person can make a difference. The way the commercial media, the way teachers, the way most things that think they are encouraging other people to become active, the way they say it is, get active. One person can make a difference. And you'll see a picture of Gandhi or Martin Luther King or this or that. Well, that's not true. One person cannot make a difference unless that one person is helping get together with others. That's what makes the difference. But another thing that's the problem is this. Getting together, helping people to get together is a very long, tedious process. The civil rights movement was the culmination of 50 years of work. We call it the 60s, but the 60s were the culmination of a lot of work. To carry out a task like I'm saying, to organize people within a Tea Party, is going to take, first of all, a lot of patience. And it's going to take dedicated people who are not there, who do not sustain themselves being organizers through victories. It takes more failures than victories. And unfortunately today, we don't operate on what I'll call real time. We operate on what we call commercial time, on computer time, on TV time, 15 minutes of fame kind of time. If you don't win a victory, to hell with it. People base their self-satisfaction on whether they win or lose. To organize, you have to be willing to lose more than you win. I mean, you only win once. But up until that one time, you lose.
And at the risk of being at the mercy of commercial time, I would love to talk with you for we've been talking for 2 hours. Thank you so much. Larry Rubin has been with me tonight talking about being a volunteer in the South during the civil rights movement, the voter registration movement, and thank you so much for for sitting down with me, and I'd love to talk to you again about the rest of your life after the 60s. So
this was a real pleasure. I really appreciate the honor of being asked to come and talk. Thank you very much.